minimum flows and levels program, where we looked at soils and ecological communities and long-term hydrologic data sets across the water management district. So all the way from Florida-Georgia boundary over to Gainesville and down just into Indian River County. Then I moved into the ERP program, and I was doing formal wetland determinations and helping with annual trainings with the Water Management District in hydric soils and wetland delineation, and supporting the DEP wetland delineations at that time. And I finished my career with the Water Management District doing FDOT mitigation. And I moved out on my own about, gosh, it's been 9, maybe 10 years ago at this point. And, you know, we do wetland delineations all over the state, soil mapping, hydric soils training. We give wetland delineation trainings to private and public sector. And, you know, we stay plenty busy doing all of those things. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see that. We're just going to do the screen. And if y'all have, you know, any questions as we're going through stuff, I believe you should have the chat available. And I think Jonathan will kind of keep an eye on that. And it would probably be easiest, since there's so many of us, that you run questions through the chat and then he can interrupt and read them, and we'll respond to the best of our ability. So for those of you that have done a lot of wetland delineation, this will just kind of be a refresher. You know, maybe you'll pick up a handful of things out of it that are like, oh yeah, I need to keep that in mind when I'm doing delineations. You know, we'll focus on the state methodology mostly, and it mostly translates to the federal wetland delineation methodology. You know, with some differences in certain community types. And I will also plan to give kind of a little bit of a WOTUS update. You know, there's a lot going on with federal jurisdiction, but there's also a lot of litigation. It's moving slowly, and so we don't have clear direction on certain things at this point. But I'll give you an update to the best of my knowledge and with the information that the EPA has put out at this point. So we're going to jump right into 62340, which is the state wetland delineation methodology. And so the state methodology, you have the Florida Administrative Code part, which includes information on plants and soils and how we go about applying the rule. So in this part of the class, we're just going to cover the non-field exercise components, and in the field, we'll do plan ID. We may do some state or federal data forms, or, you know, depending on the level of experience of the field group, or we may just go straight into flagging and implementation. So the state methodology under 62340 has been in place since 1994, and it replaced all of the prior methodologies that were being used. You know, there could potentially be 3 or 4 lines prior to that with local government methods, water management district methods, the Henderson Act, as well as federal methodology. So the Environmental Reorganization Act was really intended to consolidate the state methodologies into a single methodology that would be applied throughout the state. And the biggest intent, and it's kind of important to remember the intent, is that the first thing we should do is try to identify and delineate wetlands based on the definition of wetlands in subsection 62.340.200.19. But realizing that, there are a lot of wetland types identified in the wetland delineation methodology, but really there's only one definitive upland that's identified in the rule, and that's upland pine flatwoods that are dominated by slash and longleaf pine with a dominant subcanopy or ground cover of saw palmetto. And so, we think about, we should delineate based on the definition of wetlands, or identify based on the definition of wetlands and wetland communities. But the converse is not like 100% true in that it's like, I'm not going into that area because it's a defined upland community per FNA. Well, that goes back to, there's really only one defined upland type in 62.340, and that's the upland pine flatwoods. The definition of wetlands talks about areas that are inundated or saturated by surface water or groundwater. It talks about vegetation typically adapted for wet soil conditions or inundated soil conditions. And it talks about soils that generally have morphologies or characteristics associated with saturation, anaerobic conditions. But it also includes alluvial soils, which can be deposited by flowing water. So I do not intend to read every slide. This is being recorded. If you want to go back through it and read them, you're more than welcome to. When we typically do a wetland delineation class, a bare minimum is kind of a 2.5-day class, because there's a lot of information associated with this. So this is going to be a bigger picture overview, so that we can kind of cover a lot of ground. The definition of wetlands also has a lot of caveats, or, it talks about under normal circumstances, typically adapted for life in saturated soils, generally has these characteristics. And so, there's a lot of wiggle room in there, because ecologically, there's a lot of diversity. And, I was talking with a UF student recently that, asked if she could shadow me out in the field. And, we were talking about the vegetative index and what facultative wet meant and what obligate means, but, and what upland means. But in reality, if you have a hydric soil, you might have saturation at 6 inches below the surface. Well, a lot of these plants don't care whether saturation is at 4 inches or 10 inches. They're perfectly happy in those conditions. And so, there's this gray area where there's a lot of overlap in plant species. Some important definitions to implement the methodology correctly, or to contest something. Aquatic plants are plants that are adapted for inundated conditions. They have structural components that need water for their support. and they generally need water for their reproductive success. And so aquatic plants are a hydrologic indicator, which we'll get into in a bit, but they are obligate plants in rule. Diameter at breast height is the diameter of woody species at 4.5 feet above ground level. So that's how we determine what is a canopy species versus subcanopy versus ground cover. And then saturation is probably one of the most important definitions, particularly if you are going to contest a wetland delineation. And I'm just going to read the definition here. It means a water table 6 inches or less from the soil surface for soils with a permeability equal to or greater than 6 inches per hour in all layers within the upper 12. Or a water table 12 inches or less from the soil surface for soils with a permeability less than 6 inches per hour in any layer within the upper 12 inches. And so, basically you've got a water level and a permeability component. And basically what it's saying is, in layman's terms, in sandy soils, if you have a water table within 6 inches of the surface, that is considered saturation. And in loamy and clay soils, if you have a water table within 12 inches of the surface, that is considered saturation. And so, if you're familiar with the hydric soil indicators, you'll notice that almost all of the sandy soil indicators start within 6. And so that definition of saturation is kind of lining up with that component. And almost all of the loamy and clay indicators have to start within 12. Some of them are 8, some of them are 10, but it gives you or allows for a deeper water table to still meet the saturation condition within the definitions. The other things, we've got plant statuses. So obligate, facultative wetland, facultative, and upland. In 62.340, the definitions for those it basically just says obligate plants are those listed as obligate in chapter 62.340. Facultative wet plants are the plants that are listed as facultative wet in 62.340. And so there is a wetland delineation manual that kind of goes into more detail and talks about the intent and how we go about applying the rule. And it gives more descriptive definitions for these. And so, it talks about facultative wet plants being in wetlands most of the time, but they can occur in uplands. And then obligate plants are almost always in wetlands, but sometimes in uplands. It just gives a little bit more information. And particularly if you're just starting out, you should absolutely read the wetland delineation manual. Look at the reference sites, how they set the boundaries, look at the plant species that are in the uplands and wetlands. And almost all of the reference sites, they're wetland plants in the upland community. It's just, again, when you're near the boundary, there's going to be this area of flux, or your ecotone, in between what's absolutely upland and what's absolutely wetland. One of the big things with wetland delineation is applying reasonable scientific judgment. And I heard the more experienced people scoff or laugh. And the reason for that is, reasonable scientific judgment varies based on the amount of experience you have. The more experience you have, the more wetlands you see, the more you have done, the more it molds your reasonable scientific judgment. And what that does, it allows you to interpret minor differences in topography, minor changes in plant communities, that over many sites you've seen, oh, well, even though this is an upland plant, it's like a little bit more borderline and I see it creep into the wetlands. Or, oh, even though this is a obligate or facultative wet plant, I regularly see it in our upland communities. And so all the different site alterations, lack of fire, or an extreme fire, forest fire, something like that, ditches, drainage, different management, all of those things kind of affect what we see on the ground, plant assemblages. And so we have to use our experience to interpret what we're seeing to make good decisions. A couple natural communities that are difficult where we have to apply a lot of reasonable scientific judgment are wet flatwoods. Wet flatwoods typically have a dominant upland canopy. But it's a defined wetland community. Hydric hammocks can regularly have live oak as the dominant upland canopy. And so, we have to have a good understanding of what those communities are, the plant assemblages associated with those, so that we can apply reasonable scientific judgment to make good decisions when we're in those type of communities. So, when I'm doing a delineation, one of the first things I do is kind of evaluate my ecotones. And an ecotone is just the zone where you've got two plant communities coming together. Sometimes the ecotones are really narrow and it makes it easy. Sometimes they are many hundreds of feet wide and it makes it extremely difficult. And so, particularly when you get into South Florida, you have these really flat pine flatwoods to wet flatwoods. And, generally the Palmetto Islands are easy. It's like, okay, yeah, those are almost always upland. But then you'll have these zones in between what's definitely wet flatwoods in the Palmetto Island where it's like you lose your diversity of wet plants and you get a lot more facultative ground cover, and they can be extremely difficult because of the broad ecotone and just the grayness or difficulty in assessing whether it fits the wet flatwoods definition or not, or whether it's no longer meeting the definition of a wetland and you have to start applying tests. So, define your ecotones, try to identify something that's absolutely wetland, try to define something that's absolutely upland, and then work those edges against each other until you end up hopefully in the correct location for the wetland boundary. Many of us are familiar with this situation where it's like, oh, well, where the heck is my ecotone? I mean, I'm a little bit height challenged, and so I may not even be able to see over the gallberry, and you just don't have enough visual area to see where your actual boundaries are, and so you end up zigzagging back and forth trying to figure out where your ecotones are and where the actual boundary should be. Probably none of us get to work in something like this anymore where it's like, oh, we've got a wet prairie on one side and we've got upland pine flatwoods on the other side. That's a very discrete ecotone, makes for a very easy wetland delineation. All right. So, when we're talking about 62-340, we have to understand, we have to be able to identify a lot of different plant species. We have to know what their vegetative index or status is from a fac wet, obligate, facultative, or upland status. If we don't, we're really going to struggle to make decisions about where that wetland boundary is. we'll go through some hydrologic indicators as well as the tests and hydrologic backstop. So we're going to go through the tests first, and the A test and B test. And so basically we only go to the tests if we cannot delineate the boundary of a wetland based on the definition. And so more often than not, we are applying the tests. And these are, my prior boss, Lance Hart, always hated calling these tests because in rule, they are 62.340.300, paren 2, paren A, B, C, and D. And so the parens A, B, C, and D is where we call them the A test, B test, C test, and D test. And so the A test and B test have a plant component that we have to assess first. So the A test is your absolute cover of upland species in the appropriate strata is greater than your cover of upland species in that same strata. So if you have 5% obligate species and 4% upland species and the rest are facultative, you still meet the vegetative component of the A test. If you have 90% obligate species and 60% cover of upland species, you meet that component of the A test. And we have to have a hydrologic indicator or a hydric soil. We may have both, but you only need one of those other two components. And so your three main components for evaluating any wetland characteristics are defined in the definition of a wetland. So it talks about wet plants, talks about evidence of hydrology, and talks about hydric soils. And so those are the three components that we're always kind of considering when we're evaluating wetland boundary. And so before I even, I say this, but, once I've kind of got a comfort level with a site, before I even dig a hole, I'm evaluating my community. So am I in a defined wetland community? If not, then I'm saying, okay, what do my plants look like? Am I using my canopy, subcanopy, or ground cover? And we always start with our canopy, unless it's not natural. So oftentimes with planted pine, we will drop strata because that's a crop at that point. I have a little bit of issue there because if pines would be the natural plant species there, maybe we should be considering it under the altered sites rather than just dropping strata. That's another discussion. But, if we're not delineating based on the definition of a wetland and we're applying the tests, then I'm going to evaluate my plants first. And we start with our canopy. If we don't have 10% cover in the canopy of non-facultative species, we drop the subcanopy. If we don't have 10% cover in our subcanopy of non-facultative species, we drop to ground cover, and then we just use whatever's there. And so I always start with my plants. And if I meet one of the plant tests, so obligate greater than upland, or the plant test for the B test, which we'll talk about on the next slide, if I have a hydrologic indicator, I'm not going to bother digging a hole. And so I'll work up slope until I lose my hydrologic indicators, and then I'll start evaluating soils. It's just a quicker, more efficient way to go about it. The B test says your cover of obligate plus facultative wet species must be at least 80% of the relative cover. And you have to have a hydrologic indicator or a hydric soil. And so it's actually pretty difficult to get to 80% relative cover. If you think about, let's say you had a canopy and all the trees are about the same size. That means that 8 out of the 10 trees have to be obligate or fact wet if the other 2 are upland. And you'll notice that, facultative species are not coming into play in any of these decisions because facultative plants do not provide us a good indication of upland or wetland. And so, we do the 80% relative cover calculation as far as, obligate cover of obligate species plus cover of FAC wet species divided by cover of obligate plus cover of FAC wet plus cover of upland. Again, all in that same strata. That gives us the relative cover of wet species to all species in that strata. And so oftentimes the coverages will exceed 100% because you're giving a coverage of each individual species and each individual plant within the area that you're looking at. The C test is essentially a soils test. Basically, it says if you are one of these soil classification types, which, most of you are not going to know that unless you've been doing this a long time. And you're not going to know this in the field generally. And so this is something that you kind of have to look up in the office, or if you have the soil map app on your phone, you can pull it up and get the soil taxonomy. So these funky names are all taxonomic descriptions of different soils. Saline sands would be like salt flats. So sometimes in the upper salt marsh areas, you'll get just exposed sand where nothing grows because during high tides or abnormally high tides, water will come up and it's a little depression. And so the water will stay there, evaporate, and concentrate salts. And so nothing grows there. The more common is frequently flooded or depressional soil map units with a hydric soil in situ. So any of these components would have to have a hydric soil in situ in order to apply the C test. And we do not use the C test in upland, pine flatwoods, or improved pasture, both of which are defined in that section of the rule. Unfortunately, improved pasture is not as well defined as it should be, because it basically says, the pasture is dominated by forage grasses that were planted, and in layman's terms, and almost all pastures and yards have some small component of wet plants. Almost all of the seed mixes that are used to establish a pasture have some wetland plants, some small component of wetland seeds in it. So, it's normal to have some small component of wetland plants in an improved pasture. And so, that's where it's not quite clear. It's like, well, what if I have 15% species of wet plants in that pasture? Is it an upland improved pasture? That's where the gray area is. And so for the C test, we often need to look at the USDA NRCS mapped soils to see whether or not we have depressional or frequently flooded map units. And if we do, if we have a hydric soil within that boundary, then we could apply the C test as long as it's not in a defined improved pasture or upland pine flatwoods as defined in the C test. The D test says that you have to have a hydric soil and hydrologic indicator, and that these areas shall not extend beyond the seasonal high water elevation. And that reasonable scientific judgment indicates that inundation or saturation are present sufficient to meet the wetland definition. And so, if you go back to the definition of saturation, well, that could mean just a water table at 6 inches below the surface. And so that might be where our hydric indicators are established, which if you have, redox concentrations or stripping occurring at 6 inches below the surface, that's not giving you evidence of a seasonal high water level at or above the surface. And so you would need a hydrologic indicator to get you to that point. Where I think we've kind of put our blinders on a little bit is an application of the standalone D test, where originally the standalone D test only included these 4 indicators because they're really indicative of wet conditions. In 2008, this was modified by what we call the D test memo, and it was modified to include any other hydric soil indicator where all the criteria for the indicator are met beginning at the soil surface. And so if you have dark surface beginning at 0, that can be evidence of a seasonal high water table at the soil surface. However, there are instances in the Wetland Delineation Manual where you have dark surface to surface in the upland. There's at least one instance of 2 inches of mucky mineral, I'm almost certain, in the Wetland Delineation Manual, and it's occurring in the upland. And so there are instances where the soils might not give us the exact answer. And if we just put blinders on and be like, oh, it's dark surface to surface, it's D-test, we're calling it wetland, then we're kind of missing the point of, these caveats. These areas shall not extend beyond the seasonal high water elevation, and reasonable scientific judgment indicates that inundation or saturation are present sufficient to meet the wetland definition. And so, in these really flat, wet flatwoods to mesic flatwoods, or wet flatwoods to upland flatwoods conditions, a lot of times you don't have a lot of ground, like seepage. The groundwater table in a small area is going to be the same whether you're in the wetland or upland. And so if you do not have hydrologic indicators that are giving you evidence of saturation at or above surface, and immediately or very proximate to a hydric soil to surface, all of a sudden you go from dark surface to stripping at 7 inches or 6 inches, then application of the D-test or standalone D-test, where you're saying that dark surface gives you evidence of hydrology, would not line up with the other things that you're seeing on the site. And so just be careful with the application of the D-test and make sure that you're paying attention to the 2 caveats here. These areas shall not extend beyond the seasonal high water elevation, and reasonable scientific judgment indicates that inundation or saturation are present sufficient to meet the wetland definition. And then we have altered sites. And altered sites doesn't mean pristine. Almost everywhere we work is altered. It just means that reliable application of the definition, A, B, or C, or D tests. If you cannot use those tests to accurately delineate the landward extent of wetlands and surface waters, then you would use altered sites. If you can use any of those tests to accurately delineate the landward extent of wetlands and surface waters, then we do not go to altered sites. And so, altered sites basically allows us to use any available information, whether it's on site, adjacent to a site, aerial imagery, LiDAR data. This would be an example of an altered site where it's the soils have been turned recently, the vegetation hasn't come back. And so, in an instance like this, I would use the area directly adjacent to it to kind of establish the boundary, and then I would follow a topographic gradient if I had it. But, many of us have been out on sites that were, recently converted from pine plantation to pasture, or really just recently prepped for pine plantation, and you may just have bare dirt. And so you have to pull whatever resources you have and apply your prior knowledge and reasonable scientific judgment to establish that boundary. If the alteration is legal, then that's the route we go. If it's illegal, then you're in a compliance situation, and we essentially do the same thing, but more in a forensic manner, where we're discounting any fill material from the condition as an illegal activity. There is a hydrologic backstop, and you can set up monitoring if you disagree with the agency's decision. That monitoring has to be coordinated with the regulating agency to ensure that they will accept where you're monitoring, how you're monitoring, whether or not you're looking at a water table within 6 inches or a water table at 12 inches to give you evidence of saturation. And so hydrology indicative of a wetland, or that is not in. So if water is not inundating for 7 consecutive days or saturating for 20 consecutive days during what we would consider a normal wet season, then you can apply the hydrologic backstop and say that it no longer has hydrology sufficient to meet wetland hydrology. And so you would put in instrumentation to basically evaluate the water table. You would have to do some permeability testing to determine what depth you're evaluating. And, the inundation part is straightforward and easy. The saturation part, again, we go back to the definition of saturation. So in the sandy soils, saturation would be a water table within 6 inches of the surface. And in loamy and clay soils, saturation would be a water table within 12 inches of the surface. Surface waters, I'm not going to go way into depth in this, other than, the landward extent of wetlands and surface waters is the higher of either the wetland boundary or these features. So mean high water line for tidal systems, ordinary high water line for non-tidal systems. And the ordinary high water line we're talking about here is the ecological ordinary high water line, not the proprietary ordinary high water line for like state lands. So that's two separate things. The ordinary high water line ecologically is the point in the land where water is no longer having a driving force on the vegetative community. Basically, we consider ditches having side slopes 4:1 or steeper, and we delineate those based on top of bank. And then for swales, or surface waters that are flatter than 4:1, we only delineate those if they intercept the seasonal high water level. And so if they're just there for conveying rainwater, we don't delineate them. If they intercept the seasonal high, we do. There are exemptions for stormwater systems. And again, this is being recorded. That's generally a much lesser concern when we're doing this work. All right. So if there are any questions there,
Yeah, we did get a couple questions. And
Okay.
so one question was about the C-test. Would a native cover pocket wetland inside of an otherwise planted pine still be considered a pine flatwoods as relates to the applicability of the C-test?
So we've got two kind of components to deal with there. So for the C-test, well, actually, let me. So for the C-test, if you are mapped as frequently flooded depressional or one of these components, and you have a hydric soil in situ, then it's wetland, even if it's within an upland pine flatwoods. But we get into like a discussion of scale at that point. And in the wetland delineation manual, and whenever we take a break, I'll find this. It provides some guidance on how we're supposed to handle those. So, depending on the agency you're working with, different individuals and different agencies have a different comfort level. It's like, oh, well, is it a like little 10 by 10 pocket that doesn't connect to anything else? Yeah, probably not going to worry about that. Is it a natural depression within a upland flatwoods? Then probably so. I mean, those ephemeral little upland depressions actually have a lot of functions for frogs and salamanders, and so they have a lot of ecological value. And so it's probably important to capture that. But it does really come down to a scale, because a lot of our flatwoods do have a mosaic that you could be dominantly upland flatwoods with just some little pockets here and there. And the intent in the wetland delineation manual is that if it's dominantly in upland flatwoods, then we're not trying to capture those little tiny pockets in there. But again, it still comes down to scale, and there's I would say, a lot of variability with how agencies look at that. Now, if it's some type of finger or something that's connected to the larger wetland system or a bigger wet flatwoods, then yes, you would always grab that. But I'll find the language in the wetland delineation manual that talks about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then another question we got was on, can you explain the difference for vegetative cover between relative cover and absolute cover?
Yep. So what would be the easiest way to do this? Is my screen still sharing?
Yes.
Okay. So absolute cover is essentially, let's say I've got cypress, maple, sweet gum, slash pine, live oak. And so essentially you establish your area that you're looking at, and you want to evaluate an area within the ecotone or community that you're evaluating. And so within that ecotone, if you have 5 cypress trees, and each of those cypress trees casts a shadow over your 10-meter square that you're evaluating, because if you don't set up the area that you're evaluating, then how do you assess percent cover? So in a forested area, I'll usually do 10 meter by 10 meter, or if my ecotone's narrower, maybe I'll do 30 meters by 3 meters, or something like that. I want to stay in my ecotone. And so you assess each individual plant as if the sun were straight up and casting a shadow. And so if I have 5 cypress trees in here and they're each casting a 10% cover shadow of my quad, then I would have 50% absolute cover of cypress trees. If I've got 3 maples, and maple trees generally, can have a little bit broader canopy than a cypress tree. So if I've got 3 maples and they're each casting a 20% shadow, then I would have 60% absolute cover. If sweet gums are, there's 5 of those and they're each at 10% to 50% absolute cover. Let's say we've got 4 slash pines and they're casting, let's say they're big slash pines because they haven't been logged, they're mature, and they're each individually casting a 15% shadow, so they would have 60% cover. And I've got 1 random live oak in there that's casting a 20% shadow. So that's my absolute cover. The only plant in here that's obligate is cypress. And so from an A-test standpoint, my obligate cover is 50 and absolute cover. And my upland absolute cover is going to be 60 plus 20. So, is 50 greater than 60 plus 20? So, no. And so that's absolute cover. That's how we apply the A test. For the B test, we would say is obligate plus FAC wet. So cypress is obligate, maple's FAC wet, sweet gum's FAC wet. So we would say 50 plus 60 plus 50 divided by all the species that are non-facultative. So I'm just going to do some quick math here. 100, 220, 240. Oops. And so the relative cover would be 160 divided by 240, which is 67%. So that would not meet the 80% relative cover criteria. So it's 80% or more obligate and FAC wet species relative to all the species that are there. So we have to do obligate plus FAC wet divided by obligate plus FAC wet plus upland. Hopefully that cleared that up.
Yeah.
Any others, Jonathan?
No, that was it for right now.
All righty. Oops. So, I'm just going to run through the hydrologic indicators really quick. And this is one of the big differences between the state methodology and the federal methodology. And so all of the hydrologic indicators that we apply for 62340 are identified in 62340.500 of the delineation methodology as codified in Florida Administrative Code. This is the list of indicators that we apply: algal mats, aquatic mosses or liverworts, aquatic plants, offwucks, drift lines and rafted debris, elevated lichen lines, aquatic fauna, hydrologic data, morphological plant adaptation, secondary flow channels, sediment deposition, vegetated tussocks or hummocks, and watermarks. And so, some of these are very straightforward and easy. A couple of them, we need to apply reasonable scientific judgment. For instance, with king tides or storm events, we get rafted debris well above what we should be identifying as our limits of wetlands and surface waters. And so, understanding kind of some recent climatic or hydrologic events in the area is important to apply the hydrologic indicators, because the hydrologic indicators are supposed to be indicative of the normal hydrologic condition, not the extremes. After the was it last year or the year before, we had multiple hurricanes come up the Gulf Coast, and like there was an enormous amount of water throughout the Zephyr Hills and dates kind of all along the East Coast. And so you have lichen lines in places where it's like, this isn't even a wetland just because you've got these closed basins there because it's a little bit hilly and they just filled up with water and took, a month or 6 weeks to drain. And it's like, they haven't held water in decades, and they don't hold water on any regular basis. And they just filled up. And it's like, okay, we shouldn't be trying to force those areas to be a wetland or surface water. Even though from an engineering standpoint, in design of systems, they probably should be accounted for. They're just not providing wetland functions. So algal mats are non-vascular plants that develop under conditions of inundation. They can, when water recedes, they can be stuck to the vegetation, kind of giving us an idea of how high the water might have been. And then they can dry out and persist for a pretty long period of time. And you can tell that it's not just a soil crack, because if you look at it under a hand lens, it'll have, you'll be able to tease out fibers in that little crust. Mosses and liverworts. So realize that there are terrestrial mosses that occur on trees and vegetation in wetlands and uplands. Those terrestrial mosses need moisture too. Probably one of the most common aquatic mosses that we see in our wetlands is Fontanalis. And this is a pretty good picture of it zoomed in. Our most common terrestrial mosses are probably star moss, which can sometimes be mistaken for sphagnum in a juvenile stage. If you look at it through a hand lens, star moss is very spiky looking. Sphagnum leaves are more succulent looking. A truncated moss collar in this middle picture is not a hydrologic indicator. It's an indication of normal pool. But what you would have here, is either a lichen line or watermark. And so, the truncated moss collar itself is not a hydrologic indicator in 62-340, but it is a good indicator of a longer duration high water event, because it gets so wet that it kills off those terrestrial mosses and truncates them from the bottom side. Bryophytes, so liverworts and hornworts. These are fairly common in our wetlands as well. They, are more leafy. They almost, under hand lens, look a little bit slimy. Aquatic plants, so Nymphaea, Nufar, so water lilies, spatterdock, floating leaf vegetation, water lettuce, salvinia, bladderworts, all those type of plants require water for their life cycle and to support their structures. Aquatic plants are, we consider those obligate, so we're evaluating them in our plant coverages as well. Offwuchs, I don't know that I've actually seen off-wax other than in a marine environment when we're talking about sponges and things attached to roots. The picture on the left here may actually be a slime mold and not an off-wax. I'm not 100% on that, but I think previously when I've thought something was an off-wax, it was actually liverworts, because liverworts are pretty common where you have streams or flowing water regularly, and they'll be right at that water surface where it's constantly getting a little splash or moisture. Drift lines and rafted debris, just make sure that rafted debris is consistent with the normal high water condition, not extreme high water conditions. Elevated lichen lines. It takes about 72 hours to kill off lichens. In depressional systems that don't have flowing water, it happens fairly quick and you get a fairly uniform lichen line. In flowing systems, because the water is more aerobic, it takes a longer duration to create that lichen line. And so also in flowing systems, you'll get multiple lines from different duration high water events. And so in flowing systems, setting a normal water level based on a lichen line is significantly more difficult. Aquatic fauna. So it can be things like crayfish, tadpoles, insects that have a larval stage or some life cycle that depends on water for reproduction. All of those provide evidence of aquatic fauna. Do note that up in Nassau County, there are a couple of species of crayfish that can go significantly, they'll excavate their burrows significantly deeper. And they are excluded from this, but the recommendation is just use caution when you get into Nassau County, unless you want to have the crayfish speciated, if it makes a significant difference for your project. Secondary flow channels, so pretty obvious what those are. Morphological plant adaptations. So these are specialized structures or tissues that are produced by plants in response to inundation or saturation. The primary function is generally to get oxygen into the plant tissue or provide stabilization. So adventitious roots. Now, adventitious roots often don't provide the highest water level, because they are usually forming at the water surface after it's been there for a lengthy period of time, or below the water surface. Just like hypertrophied lenticels over here on the right photo, which I think that looks like it's on Sambucus, which will readily form hypertrophied lenticels, or hypertrophied, however you say it. And so they don't give an indication of water level either. They're just a example of a tissue response to stress. So basically, they're opening up their pores, trying to get more oxygen into the tissue, but it doesn't give us a evidence of a particular water level, like a white lichen line or watermark. Buttressing. So, just realize with buttressing and hummocking that those can be reflective of hydrologic conditions that are no longer present. So once it forms that structure, it's going to maintain that structure regardless of whether or not water's there. Certain species will kind of form this buttressing or fluting regardless of whether it's wet or not. And so again, using reasonable scientific judgment here is pretty key. Pine trees can form buttresses in wetter conditions. So those are 3 different examples of pine trees with buttresses, and basically it's just significantly wider at the base, kind of comes up, curves into the main trunk, and then it's fairly straight from there up. You know, this cypress tree's in somebody's yard, southern magnolia in the background, and it's a couple feet above street level. Definitely not a wetland, and you see knees all over on the ground, and you can see that not only the cypress but the southern magnolia are both have a little bit of fluting or a little bit of widening at the base. And so just realize that trees, as they get larger, some naturally do that. And also maybe there's some obstruction below the ground, dense clay, limestone boulders, other things that are going to cause a morphological response. Red mangrove roots are hydrologic indicator, prop roots. Sediment deposition, so sand or other material deposited due to flowing water. You can see like silt deposited on all of these cypress trees at a certain height. Sediment can be deposited on top of leaves as well. Vegetated hummocks or tussocks. These are generally clumps of soil and vegetation that are higher than all of the surrounding ground, with a lot of stuff growing on them, whether it's ferns, shrubs, sedges, herbs, whatever it is. They're generally higher than the ground all around them. Obviously, the more hog damage you have in an area or the more human alteration, the more difficult it is to definitively say you have some of these features. Hummocks are one that, we may consistently argue with regulatory staff or between regulatory staff and environmental consultants, because the larger a tree is, the more root mass it's going to put in the ground. And if it's raised a little bit, it may have nothing to do with hydrology. And so differentiating what is a hummock associated with hydrology versus what is just a natural slight rise due to tree size or something like that can be challenging. In this instance, it's like you can see all the area around this tree was converted to pasture. They likely removed and compacted some soil a little bit. And so the natural soil surface may have actually been right up at the base of that tree. It's difficult to assess. And so, one of the things that I've always struggled with hummocking is in the Wetland Delineation Manual, it talks about hummocks and tussocks being associated with long periods of saturation or inundation. And so if I don't have a hydric soil, or if I just barely say I have a hydric soil with stripping or redox at 6 inches, that's not giving me evidence of long periods of saturation or inundation. And so I kind of question whether or not we should be trying to force something to be a vegetated hummock due to hydrology and calling it a hydrologic indicator. And, there are many instances of this where, live oaks, or not just live oaks, but there are a bunch of live oaks in the background of this picture, will be hummocked just due to root mass above the surrounding ground. They might have some weak fluting on the base of the trunks because they're supporting significant structure above ground. And again, some of these features have nothing to do with hydrology. And so it's like teasing out where does it become associated with hydrology and where does it not, is always a challenge. So this is a live oak right on the edge of a salt marsh. This is probably legitimately a hummock. There were very wet soils all around this. The ground level was lower all around it. And so it might legitimately be a hummock associated with wet conditions. Watermarks. So here you probably have a combination of watermark and lichen lines or hydrologic data. So Hydrologic data can be actual monitoring data that you have. It can be direct observation of water if you're in a normal wet season, or if you're in a drier than a normal wet season and you have water, that's also a good indication. But if you just had 20 inches of rain, well, there's going to be water in a lot of places that are not hydrologic data as far as representing the normal wet condition. I've already talked about this once or twice. So any hydric soil indicator where all criteria are met beginning at the surface can be used as evidence of hydrologic data because there's correspondence between the NRCS and DEP that basically said, hey, your seasonal high occurs where these indicators start. And so, that was kind of documented in the 2008 memo, D-test memo from DEP. If we are applying this as a standalone D-test, we do in fact want to make sure that the soil that we are observing does in fact have evidence of saturation or inundation to surface to be consistent with the D-test. All right. So the Corps has a lot bigger list of hydrologic indicators than the state. And they allow, primary indicators and secondary indicators. There are a lot of similarities, but you have a few that are worth looking at is surface water, and it doesn't really caveat it with a normal hydrologic condition. It just says it's there. High water table within 12 inches of the surface in your shovel or auger hole. Saturation within 12 inches. So if you're digging and the soil is saturated, that's a primary hydrologic indicator. Water stained leaves, which is not something that is typically used in the state methodology. It possibly could fall under watermarks because it's affecting the color of the leaves. I haven't actually seen that really applied that way, though. Let's see. Reduced iron within 12. This is what I was looking for. So oxidized rhizospheres. So this is one we would think about oxidized rhizospheres. Okay, redox concentrations. Well, that we would think from a hydric soil standpoint that needs to begin within 6 inches of the surface. Well, here they allow it to go down to start within 12, but it does have to be on live roots. And so that's the key with oxidized rhizospheres. One of the ones that we've had, well, I'll go ahead and do dry season water table. So during a normal dry season or drier than normal dry season, a water table between 12 and 24 inches gives us a secondary indicator. That's not that uncommon in flatwoods, depending on the time of year you go out there. Geomorphic position can be one that is a little bit contentious with the Corps, but it really does talk about drainage ways and floodplains, toes of slopes, fringes of ponds, or in areas where there's groundwater discharge. And so I know at times the Corps has pushed the idea of, well, any flat landscape gives us geomorphic position. I've never applied it that way and have been fairly successful with the core and arguing that just because it's a flat landscape, that doesn't fall into this geomorphic position. It's really quite easy to meet the hydrologic component in the core methodology, because it's very common to meet your fact neutral test, which gives you a secondary indicator. And then, it's very common to meet saturation within 12 or a dry season water table. And so I find that it's pretty darn easy to meet the hydrology component for the core, as well as the vegetative component. All right. Any questions there, Jonathan?
Not necessarily a question, but there was a mention about that DEP, I guess, had suggested potentially using hog rub as a soft indicator.
I wasn't gonna bring that up, but so I have heard this from multiple folks that at one of DEP's last trainings that, and you have to realize that they're training young people that don't have any experience. And so they're taking this information and then applying it without the lens of reasonable scientific judgment. And so I've heard from multiple reliable sources that at one of DEP's last trainings that they did say that, well, hog rooting is a good evidence of a hydrologic indicator. And it's like, that's nowhere in 62-340. Hogs will root up anywhere. Is it common that they root around the edge of wetlands and moist soils? Absolutely. But it's kind of like a facultative plant species. It really doesn't give us a good indication either way, because in really wet times, hogs might just root up somebody's pasture. And so, yes, I have heard that. No, it is not in 62-340. And if somebody were applying that, I don't even feel like it's good, reasonable scientific judgment, because it occurs all over the place. It's also going to depend on how many hogs there are there. The larger the population, the more they're going to chew stuff up. So, yes, I've heard that. It's not in the rule, and I would say at best it's borderline on the reasonable scientific judgment scale. All right. Let's see. Oops. There we go. So this is the 2008 wetland D-test memo. And it talks about those areas where one or more hydrologic indicators are present and which have a hydric soil as identified using the approved soil indicators. And reasonable scientific judgment indicates that inundation or saturation is present sufficient to meet the wetland definition. These areas shall not extend beyond the seasonal high water elevation. And so those last two sentences are lost a lot of times in application of the D-test. And so, it's on us as consultants and those being regulated to, if somebody is pushing the D-test beyond the seasonal high water elevation, then it's upon us to demonstrate that, whoa, wait a second. In the D-test memo, it says this, and I understand there's a hydric soil to surface there, and that can be indicative of a seasonal high water level to surface. But in this case, it is not because of these other things. And so, you could have, for instance, and it's harder to do this if there is any slope to the land, because then you can have groundwater contributing to that saturation, and driving that seasonal high water level to surface. But if you're in a flatter landscape and you just have slight rises and it's groundwater driven, then I think it's a little bit easier, because if you have lichen lines or some other hydrologic indicator lower in the landscape that is not projecting above the soil surface where the D-test is trying to be applied, then you've got really good evidence to say, no, we can't apply the D-test here because that is extending beyond the seasonal high water elevation. So you've got to meet both components. Does reasonable scientific judgment indicate that inundation or saturation is present, sufficient to meet the wetland definition? And these areas shall not extend beyond the seasonal high water elevation. And so we can use hydrologic indicators or soil morphologies upslope to kind of bracket that D-test area to demonstrate that it is or is not extending beyond the seasonal high water elevation.
A question on that. How do you
Yes.
determine where, I guess, the seasonal high water line and the soil, where they intersect in the field?
Okay, so our guidance is that if you have an indicator where all criteria are met at the surface, that can provide evidence of saturation at the soil surface and which is a seasonal high at the surface. But if you do not think that it actually has a seasonal high at the surface, then we use all of our morphologies that we use to identify hydric soils to assess the seasonal high. So if we have sandy redox at 4 inches, just upslope of where we had dark surface to surface, well, that's the sandy redox is saying, no, it's down here at 4 or 5 or 6. And so we're using those morphologies to give us evidence of seasonal high saturation in the soil. And, generally speaking, that's over a short distance, that's going to be relatively flat. So if we have a lichen line or adventitious roots a little bit deeper in the wetland, and we've got stripping or redox, at 5 or 6 inches into the uplands or 7 inches, if you drew a straight line between those, and between that line you had a hydric soil at surface, but the line between the hydrologic indicator and the soil indicator upslope were below that, that would give you evidence that the soil expression between them is above the seasonal high water. And I guess that's hard to explain in words. It would be a heck of a lot easier to draw. I was going to say, I thought I had some drawing tools on here, but I am not seeing them. I can do it in a Word document real quick. And so let's see. So if that is our ground surface, and I've got a lichen line right here, that projects out to hit the ground surface at this point. I may have a hydric soil to surface all in this area, which gives me evidence of saturation to surface, which would not be extending above the seasonal high water, because I've got evidence of that indicator giving me evidence of saturation to surface. However, if right above this, I've got stripping a redox down here, well, that probably should be just a hair higher. Somewhere right in here. Well, that's telling me my seasonal high water table is doing that. And so application of D-test, the standalone D-test with this soil in this region is above my seasonal high because I've got evidence downslope and upslope of the seasonal high. And so not that I don't have a hydric soil to surface, it's just it would be extending the wetland boundary beyond the seasonal high at that point. And so that's how I would use my evidence in the soil, my evidence in the wetland to say that this is an inappropriate application of D-test because they might want to put the wetland boundary right here at the upper extent of where the hydric soil indicator is met at the surface. So hopefully that kind of clarified all of my rambling words there.
Travis, so you couldn't put the line at the where the seasonal high and ends?
Yes, so in this case, that would be the appropriate place to put it because, assuming you didn't meet a vegetative component up in here, because if you met a vegetative component, you would still have a hydric soil, so you'd be looking at the A or B test. Or if you were in a depressional map unit, but not in a upland flatwoods or improved pasture, you would still be taking the line to this upper point. But, outside of those, if you're in the position of applying the D-test, in this instance, even if you had a hydric soil to surface, if you can demonstrate that, nope, our seasonal high that our seasonal high from the wetland is intercepting the ground here, and our seasonal high in the soil upslope is below grade, such that when you draw a line between the two, it's below the ground surface. That's telling you that even though the soil has a indicator met at surface, the seasonal high water table is actually below surface. And the D-test memo specifically says you shall not extend the wetland boundary beyond the seasonal high. We're just using the soil indicator when it occurs at surface as evidence of the seasonal high. And so it's giving us that hydrologic data component. But I'm just saying that it's not always the case. And so, if we think it's being applied inappropriately, this would be the approach to demonstrate that, nope, that's an inappropriate application of the D-test per the memo. And, we've got evidence of a seasonal high well below grade up above that. And we know that the water table is not doing this. We know the water table is not going, oh, all of a sudden I've got a hydric soil to surface. Now it's up here, and oh, I hit the wetland, and the wetland indicators are down here. That's not happening. And so an indicator of a hydric soil at surface is oftentimes a good indicator of saturation to surface, but it's not always. We just have to remember that the D-test memo has these specific caveats in here about, reasonable scientific judgment, and these areas shall not extend beyond the seasonal high water elevation. So we got to keep in mind those caveats when applying the D-test. Are we good for one more, or did you want to take a break, Jonathan?
I mean, if We can keep on going.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, I'm not going to do much on plant ID. I am not a botanist. I know a lot of plants because I do it all the time, and I know what the plant is because that's what the plant looks like, or I can, bust open the seed and look at the seed on certain species and tell what it is. But I am not a botanist. I can handle some field botany and ID of most of the common species that we deal with. But we're really not going to cover plant ID in this other than talking about, the status and which strata to use. And so we pretty much covered the plant components that we're going to cover. We've talked about the rule. We've talked about hydrologic indicators. And so now we're going to have, I'll cover hydric soils and soil formation a little bit. And then we'll kind of wrap up the day with WOTUS and where we're going to end up in the field. So, if you break down wetlands to the most simple aspect, hydrology is a critical component. And, all of our hydric soil indicators, all of our plant statuses are tied back to hydrology, giving us evidence of that wetness. And that's what I use soils for. I use soils to understand hydrology so that I can make a good decision about, wetland boundaries or stormwater pond design or development of mitigation sites. So, if you understand hydrology, then you can usually make good decisions about these other factors. And generally speaking, the more well drained a soil is, the more it tends to have, yellow and orange colors, which are indicative of oxidized iron or rust. And I'm really going to focus on Florida soils here, rather than soils in other regions of the United States. If we were in kind of Northwest Alabama, Kentucky region, we would be having different conversations because there is a lot of black parent soil material. And so the blackness of the soil is not indicative of hydrology. And so you kind of have to have an idea about what is the soil we're dealing with. In Florida, that dominant soil material is quartz. And so I talk about the things that impart color on quartz in peninsular Florida. That's largely iron and organic matter. So iron in an oxidized form or rust form is going to be solid, and it imparts yellows, tans, oranges, reds, where organic matter tends to impart things from the blacks, the grays, and into the browns. And generally speaking, when you're in that intermediate range of wetness, you usually get a pretty good amount of soil profile development. When you're on the really dry side or really wet side, the soil can look pretty uniform. Either if it's dry, it might be uniform yellow or orange or red. And if it's really wet, it might be just black and gray. And so we'll talk a little bit about soil formation, kind of not as its own category, but throughout this discussion. Talk just in general about organic matter and iron and the specific components for identification of hydric soils, and then we'll just run through the most common indicators that we use for delineation. So the soil on the right is from one of the ridge areas in Florida, east of Eustis, and it's an geologically old landform, but the soils are like pretty bright orange, and that's down about 8 or 9 feet, and it's nice and consistently orange. The water just moves through it so quickly that it really doesn't have time to act on the iron. And so if we took that soil and removed all the iron, this is what it would look like on the right-hand side, kind of this just white sand. And if you look at it under a microscope, this is what our quartz sand looks like. Pure quartz is transparent, but you can see all the angles and fractures and inclusions. And so what it reflects back to us is white. We don't rarely see soils that are pure white. Even most of our beaches have soils that have a slight tan tinge to them, and that's iron minerals and other minerals imparting that color. When we're dealing with hydric soil indicators, we have to know where we are in space, because the climate has an effect on soil formation. And so, the kind of biggest things for us to remember are that in land resource region U, we just have to have muck presence. In land resource regions P and T, we have to have 1 centimeter of muck. I also believe, and I'll double check this, that the indicators S8 poly value below surface and S9 thin dark surface are valid in U and T, but not valid in P. And so these land resource regions, all they're doing is capturing differences in the climatic conditions. So rainfall and temperature are the 2 primary things that go into defining the land resource regions. And when you think about soil formation, temperature and moisture or rainfall are really important for the formation of soil. And the biggest part of that is the colder it is, the more it slows down microbial activity, and so it makes it easier to accumulate carbon. The wetter it is, generally the more plant growth you have, and so you have higher productivity, and so it makes it a little bit easier to accumulate carbon. And so I'll talk a little bit about organic matter accumulation, and then we're going to talk a little bit about iron. I'll keep it relatively simple for this process. Basically, to get carbon accumulation, you have to have enough carbon or organic matter production to exceed the loss. And we have some pretty big pathways of loss. If something burns on a regular basis, you're going to have less carbon in the soil. If the quality of the organic matter is really poor, it's going to make it easier to accumulate carbon. And I guess poor might be a bad choice of words. It's the quality of the organic matter for microorganisms to consume. And so it should probably say the complexity, chemical complexity of the organic matter. So like pine needles, live oak leaves, sawgrass, all have a lot of complex lignins. And so they have a tendency to accumulate above the soil surface as peat or a duff layer, where grasses have a lot more labile or a lot simpler organic compounds, and so they get incorporated into the soil much more easily. The wetter a site is, generally it accumulates more carbon, and the reason is not directly due to wetness. It's because wetness reduces the amount of oxygen in the soil, which then slows microbial consumption of the organic matter. And so if it's wetter, it's going to slow down microbial activity and allow carbon to accumulate. If it's colder, it's going to slow down microbial activity and allow carbon to accumulate. So, just when we're in the field, it's something to keep in mind. It's like if something's really fire suppressed, it's going to have more duff accumulated on the surface, which is going to protect the superficial soil and allow more carbon to be put into the soil. So all of these factors kind of come into play, like in that reasonable scientific judgment part of our brain when we're evaluating a site. Just some organic matter details. So to be organic matter, the soil only has to have about 25% organic material. The rest can be mineral. And so our mineral components would be sand, silt, and clay, or the textures associated with those. But organic acids they're amorphous and they have a lot of charge. And so they impart a lot of properties onto the soil without a high percentage of it. We determine whether or not something's organic material using the near saturated rub test. We're only applying that if we think the soil is organic. If right away we know that it's mineral, then we're not applying the near saturated rub test. If we are unsure, then we might apply the near saturated rub test to determine that it's organic or mucky mineral or mineral. DEP has a decant test that they have kind of put forth in their wetland data form guide. I haven't seen any data for it. It doesn't seem unreasonable, other than the way they go about it. Any of you that have attended any of my classes out of this have probably seen me use a syringe to get more accurate volumetric comparisons. And I'm sure we'll do that in the field component of this. So if you determine that the soil's organic, then you have to determine whether it is muck, mucky peat, or peat, which is a representation of the level of decomposition. So muck is well decomposed organic material, mucky peat is intermediately decomposed, and peat is poorly decomposed. I do want to point out one change from version 8 to version 9 of the field indicators of hydric soils. The definition of muck has been altered, and I don't know if this was done in response to the rubbed fiber content test or not, but it's here now. And so it basically says sapric organic soil material, or muck, is sapric organic soil material, in which virtually all of the organic material is so decomposed that identification of plant forms is not possible. We use muck only with organic horizons that are saturated for 30 or more cumulative days in normal years. And so, 30 days of saturation is more days of saturation than required in the wetland hydrologic backstop. And so, it seems that, use of muck in a wet flatwoods at the bottom of a duff layer might not be consistent with this definition. With that said, this is 30 or more cumulative days. And so I think it's pretty darn easy to get to 30 or more cumulative days versus in the hydrologic backstop, it talks about saturation for 20 continuous days. So, we're dealing with two different kind of components of hydrology. And so this could be saturated for 2 days at a time, 15 different days through a wet season. And so it's probably fairly easy to get to that, but it's trying to get us to identify muck correctly, and that it's telling us, hey, this is well decomposed organic material. almost all of the organic material is so decomposed that identification of plant forms is not possible. Now, there still is information about the rubbed fiber content in the beginning of the field indicator guide. And so this is just another component that we have to tie in to make sure that we're identifying muck correctly. With the near saturated rub test, if the soil has a high carbon content and we think it's more than mineral, we're going to get it nearly saturated. And if you don't get it nearly saturated, you are going to overestimate the carbon content, because the intent is to get it nearly saturated, which disperses the carbon and makes it easier to feel that mineral component. So you get it nearly saturated. You rub it gently between your thumb and forefinger. And if you feel a little bit of grittiness on the first or second rub, and I'm not saying 1 grain or 2 grains, it's like you should feel kind of a consistent grittiness, then it's just mineral. And then you might have to determine the mineral texture, whether it's sandy or loamy and clay. If you did not feel grittiness on those first 2 rubs, then you rub it a 3rd, 4th, and 5th time. If you felt grittiness on those, it's mucky mineral. And if you didn't feel that grittiness within 5, it's organic. Then you have to determine the level of decomposition of the organic. Is it muck? Is it mucky peat? Or is it peat? When there is a significant amount of silt and clay in the sample, you may not feel grittiness. You may feel stickiness or a resistance to rubbing across it. And if you feel those things, it's probably just mineral or mucky mineral. And so, it gets significantly more difficult when you get silt and clay in the sample. So we've got organic textures, and then we've got our mineral textures. Mineral textures are just composed of different percentages of sand, silt, and clay particles, with sand being the largest particles, silt particles being an order of magnitude smaller than that, and then clay particles being an order of magnitude smaller than silt particles. Luckily for us, most of our first superficial soils are right here in this sandy range. And so more often than not, we're going to apply A indicators, which are for all textured soils, and S indicators, which are for sandy textured soils. And so this is when we're identifying hydric soils, this is the first thing we want to do. We want to texture the soil. We want to determine if there's anything organic or not, so that we know our first break in indicators. Whether we always use A indicators, but the A indicators dominantly deal with carbon accumulation. And so if there's not anything organic or mucky mineral, then a lot of times we'll be out of the A indicators, and we're just determining, okay, is the soil sandy or is it loamy and clay? And so sandy indicators are going to use sand and loamy sand textures. The F indicators, or fine textured indicators, are going to use everything else. The primary difference between loamy sand and sandy loam is that you'll be able to get a little bit of a ribbon out of the sandy loam material, and usually you won't be able to get much of a ribbon at all out of the loamy sand. So that's generally the kind of layperson's break between the two. And so this is the USDA NRCS key for texturing soils. This applies to the entire United States, and I know this is a little bit small here. And since it's for the entire United States, we have to have a little bit of give on the upper part of the key. Because it says, does the soil remain in a ball when squeezed? No, then it's sand. Yes. We go down to the next component. We can go to the beach and grab some sand and squeeze it. If it's moist, it'll stay in a ball. It's because we have a lot of fine sand compared to a lot of other regions of the country. And so, again, we got to have a little bit of play at the first part of this. But once you get down to the lower section where you're determining The breakdown of the fine textured material, it's pretty darn good. All right. Let's talk a little bit about iron accumulation and loss. Kind of the big picture here is iron is rust in the soil. We kind of have three dominant pathways to get iron to move. The one that we're interested in is oxidation reduction. One of the other pathways is through acid stripping, which is more of a long-term, I don't know if I would say geologic, but thousands of years process, where small fractions of iron are slowly moved down in the profile with rainwater. And what it results in is the upper part of the soil being white, and then down below, you get this nice, consistent yellow soil. That's not indicative of a water table. It's just more of a slow process of iron removal. And it results in something that's fairly uniformly white and something that's fairly uniformly yellow below the white layer. You can just erode or move the entire soil, and that's one way to move the iron. And then the third pathway, which is the one we're interested in for hydric soils, is oxidation and reduction. So in an oxidized state, the iron's solid, it's rust, it's yellow, red, orange colors. When you reduce iron, it goes into solution, is colorless and mobile. The way that you get iron to go into solution is basically the process of reduction. And what it is the metabolic process of microorganisms consuming carbon. And in their metabolic process, they have to use things to get rid of their waste products. Right now, we're metabolizing whatever we ate this morning or last night. And as part of our process, we're breathing in air and we're breathing out CO2 and water vapor. So microorganisms do the same thing. In an aerobic environment, they use oxygen and it produces water vapor, and they can operate very efficiently and very quickly to consume carbon. And so in aerobic environments, we have a lot less carbon accumulation. When you add water to a site, you restrict oxygen diffusion into the soil. And so microorganisms have to use other things. One of those things is iron. But before they get to iron, because it costs them energy to use iron, they use up all the manganese or all the oxygen, they use up all the nitrates, they use up all the manganese, and then they use iron in their metabolic process. And so when they use iron, it goes from the oxidized state into the reduced state where it's mobile. Wherever that reduced iron hits an oxygenated zone, whether it's a root channel, whether it's a spot in the soil that had a little air bubble, that iron will fairly instantaneously oxidize and become solid again, and then it's stuck at that location in the soil. And so that's the process of generating either oxidized rhizospheres, where plants are pumping oxygen into their root zone, or soft masses where iron hits a little air bubble just within the soil profile and oxidizes out of solution. And so on the left here are just the chemical components that are used for the oxidation reduction process. And so, any of you that have dug deeper in the soil or dealt with deep stormwater ponds or borrow pits or anything like that, you know that there's oxidized iron in the soil well below the water table. And it's like below the water table almost all the time. And, how is it oxidized under the water table? Well, it's in an oxidized state because without that microbial driver, it's the microbes' metabolic process. Nothing happens with the iron. It just sits there. And so this oxidation reduction process requires that microbial component and the carbon for them to basically consume the carbon, go through their metabolic process, reduce the iron, and mobilize it. So, what deeper in the soil profile, we have a lot less carbon, we have a lot less microbes, and so it's a lot more difficult or a lot slower process to reduce the iron and mobilize it. I just have a couple of good examples of iron concentrations here. This is a perfect example of a pore lining. This was along a live root channel, and so it would fit the oxidized rhizosphere hydrologic indicator for the core if it occurred within 12 inches. All right. Briefly, we're going to go over the critical factors for ID for hydric soils. Almost all the indicators talk about a layer with specific colors and textures. And so texture is that first component of, we got to understand texture, and we got to be able to texture things relatively quickly to figure out our indicators, because that's our first break. And then once we've made that first break, we know whether we're in A and S or A and F indicators, and then we have to evaluate the specific criteria. So each of these layers, say a layer with these specific colors and percentages or features, beginning within a certain depth. And so color is one of the most important criteria right next to texture. All of our colors, we use the Munsell color book, are composed of a hue, which you can see on the top right of this page, which is 10YR. 10YR is a specific color combination of yellow and red. Then we have the value along the y-axis, which is a measure of lightness and darkness. So low value is darker, high value is lighter. And then chroma, which is like dye or the intensity of the color. Low chroma is dark, high chroma has a high intensity of color. And so most of our hydric soil indicators talk about soils with chroma 2 or less, because we want most of the iron that's imparting these yellow, orange, or reddish colors to be removed from the soil, giving us dull colors. So wetness generally results in duller colors with maybe concentrations of high color. All it is a color matching exercise. And so the 10YR page is the most common place to start in our superficial soils in Florida. If the soil is redder than that, we go to the left to the 7.5 YR, 5 YR, 2.5 YR. If the soil is less red or brown than the 10 YR, we go to the right to the 2.5 Y, 5 Y, and so on. We always want to look at moist soils. We want to look at them in consistent light. If you have sunlight available, you should color it in the sunlight. If not, just make sure it's not like partial shade, partial sun. Go to one or the other. We don't rub the soil. We don't pat the soil. We don't smear the soil. We take a chunk of it, break it open. If it's not moist, we spray it. Moist means that when you're spraying it, it's no longer changing color. The Munsell charts will fade with use. Most people probably can get 2 or 3 years out of their Munsell book. I tend to replace mine every year, although for certain things I'll use an old one, and then on more important things I'll bring a new one, because we all know they are ridiculously expensive for what they are. All right, so kind of just a summary here. The soil morphology gives us evidence of wetness. The drier soils tend to have more oxidized iron, and so they display brighter colors associated with that rust or oxidized iron. The wetter it gets, generally the more profile development or soil profile or horizon development we get, the more layers. But they tend to start losing that orange or yellow or tan colors and tending more toward the toward the low chroma dull colors of browns, blacks, and whites. And then the more wet you get, the soil really gets dull, generally speaking, where you can accumulate some carbon on the surface and just have gray colors below. All right. I need to take about a 5-minute, or let's take a 10-minute break. Jonathan, unless people have questions at that point, I would say let's take a 10-minute break, pause the video, and then we'll come back and go through all right. So we're going to pick up with just a quick review of hydric soil indicators. And I know that I have been going through things quickly. This is intended to be kind of a review and precursor for those that are joining us in the field on the 28th, so that at least we're all kind of starting from some base level of understanding. And so, having taught a lot of hydric soil classes, and when I was at the Water Management District, teaching a couple day class every year to each of the offices, I realized that a lot of people struggle to narrow down the indicators quickly. And so I kind of stepped back and looked at my mental process to do it. And so I kind of break them down into soil indicators that are associated with carbon accumulation, and then then the other soil indicators. And so, when you're evaluating a soil, again, the first thing you want to do is texture it. I always ask myself, if there's a decent amount of carbon in the surface, is there muck? Is there mucky mineral or organic bodies? And for us doing delineation, we're not necessarily worried about documenting the soil unless we're doing core data forms. But we're trying to make a decision quickly about, is the soil wet? Is it wet enough for me to call it hydric? And how does that affect my delineation? And so, like I was saying, if it is dark near the surface, I ask myself, is there muck, mucky mineral, or organic bodies? And by dark near the surface, if it's sandy, or I think it's sandy, it has to be at least 70% or more masked by organic matter to meet that dark criteria. And if the answer's no about the dark part and the masking part, then you're really down to strip matrix or sandy redox in a sandy soil. If the answer is yes, is there muck, mucky mineral, organic bodies? If the answer is yes to any of them, you might have to do the near saturated rub test. If the answer is no, then you have a few carbon accumulation sandy indicators to work through. So that's my recommendation to get through the indicators quickly. Obviously, if you are less familiar with the texturing methods and the coloring, then it's going to take a little bit more time. The good news is, for delineation, we're really only dealing with, 9 indicators most of the time, for us in Florida. And in most other regions of the US, they're only dealing with, a few of the A indicators and these 2 F indicators most of the time. And so, soils for them, like most people in Florida, are like uncomfortable with the loamy and clay soils, but there's a lot less to deal with most of the time for delineation with loamy and clay soils. And so when they come to Florida or the coastal plain and they're having to deal with sandy soils, they really struggle. And so, one of the things that ends up being discussed a lot in the field is percent masking. We can't do a great job showing that on a photo, but essentially 70% of the particles have to be a 3-1 or darker to be considered masked. And a 3-1 is the value in chroma, so it's a really dark gray color. 30% of the particles can be a 4-1 or lighter and meet that 70% masking criteria. And so in this example, we probably have somewhere in the, close to 90 range on the left, 75 to 80 in the middle, and depending on where you look on the right, if you look right in that middle, that's not very masked. And so that might be more like 60, but kind of everything around that little middle chunk of soil is a little bit more masked. So if you were looking at that as an overall, it might be kind of right at that 70% masking criteria. The other one that I've seen misapplied a lot is strip matrix. This is about as good of an example of strip matrix as you will get. I found my drawing tools. So, there's a ton of stripped areas in this. I'm just going to circle a handful, and I'm going to try to stay off the boundary. And so the stripped areas are lighter in color, and they kind of have this diffuse color gradient where it's hard to, I don't know why that happened, hard to pinpoint the boundary between the lighter material and the rest of the soil matrix. And so there are a lot of other stripped areas in those handful, but we're always looking at the lighter material. Most of the time, for us in Florida, we're dealing with stripping of carbon. And you can see like some dead root channels right in the center, or specks of carbon right in the center of a few of the stripped areas. But it's a lot harder to see strip matrix when it's stripping of carbon versus stripping of iron. When you're dealing with iron stripping, it is much easier to see because you're dealing with a chroma difference rather than a slight value difference. And so it's easy to see that color change when you're dealing with iron. All right, so we're going to just run through the most common indicators that we use for delineation. So organic bodies are aggregates of soil material generally attached to roots that have to meet a muck or mucky mineral texture, and they have to be 2% or more by volume of a given layer. Sandy redox says that you have to have 2% or more redox concentrations starting within 4 inches of the soil surface. Starting within 6 inches of the soil surface. And that layer with redox has to be at least 4 inches thick. The layer directly beneath the layer with 4 inches of redox has to have a matrix color of chroma 2 or less. We talked about strip matrix. Basically, organic acids or metal oxides are being stripped from the soil, exposing the primary base colors. It has to begin within 6 inches. The stripped areas have to be at least 10% by volume, and there is no thickness requirement. And so if it starts within 6 inches of the soil surface and you have 10% or more stripped areas by volume, then you meet the criteria for that indicator. More often than not, the stripped areas will increase from, maybe 5% before you get to that 10% boundary, to 10%, to 20%, to 30% over a 2 or 3 inch layer. And so if I'm identifying something as strip matrix, I want to see a progressively stronger expression of strip matrix as I go down in the profile, that gives me a really high level of confidence that I am identifying that indicator correctly. Dark surface says that you have to have a 4-inch thick layer that is a value of 3 or less, chroma 1 or less, with 70% or more of the particles being covered, coated, or masked by organic material. And that layer has to begin within 6 inches of the soil surface. Poly value, poly, many, value being a measure of lightness and darkness. So multiple values or multiple areas of light and dark. This indicator says that you have to have a layer that is 70% or more masked. It doesn't have a thickness requirement, underlain by this kind of dark and light splotchiness. There's some specific criteria to it, but essentially this is a good example of poly value, but it doesn't begin at the surface. It's beginning at about 4 inches because the layer from 0 to 4 is not more than 70% masked. So you got to have that masked layer underlain by dark and light splotchy. This is S9 thin dark surface. It basically says you have a layer that is 2 inches or more thick, that is dark, so 3-1 or darker, 70% or more masked, underlain by dark gray, so 4-1 or darker, to 12 inches or topospodic. And so this profile would actually meet poly value as well, since it's got some light pockets in there. Now, I rarely actually observe thin dark surface, where poly value is much more common. Both of these indicators have some user notes to apply them correctly. Poly value talks about a differential distribution of carbon due to water movement, where thin dark surface talks about an even distribution of carbon due to water movement. And so the two indicators probably have like slightly different hydrologic regimes to result in those morphologies, where poly value probably has a flashy hydrology where it comes up and down many times during the wet season, where where thin dark surface probably is this little bit slower pulse of water up and down. And so rather than stripping out all of the carbon, it's just kind of translocating carbon down in the profile to result in a more even distribution of carbon. F3 depleted matrix says that this one's hard to talk about without visual aids, but basically you have to meet a loamy and clay soil, and the depleted layer has different thickness requirements if it's in the upper 6 inches versus if it's starting below 6 inches. And so the color criteria for depleted matrix are a value of 4 or more, chroma 2 or less. So you're dealing with generally gray colors. The lower 4 chips, 4.1, 4.2, and 5.2, have to have redox concentrations. The layer has to be at least 2 inches thick if it occurs within the upper 6, and it has to be at least 6 inches thick if it is beginning at 6 inches or below. And the reason for that is in a loamy and clay soil, you can, and I haven't seen this as much in Florida as I have in like Alabama and Georgia, basically you can get these depressions where you're getting a perched water table above the clay stuff. And so your upper few inches of the soil will get really depleted or gray, but the water's there and for such a short duration that you're not depleting the subsoil. And so it allows you to have this thin layer of depleted soil in the surface and still meet the indicator. Where in Florida, when we're dealing with loamy and clay soils that are wet, generally that water is there for a long enough period to really deplete all of the clayey material. Umbric surface is really a pretty easy indicator, but you kind of have to step back because it's talking about two separate components, but you have to have a 10-inch thick layer that meets these components. And so umbric surface says you're dealing with a 10-inch thick loamy and clay layer. The upper 6 inches have to be black, so a 3-1 or darker. The lower 4 inches can be that same color or any color that's chroma 2 or less. So you can have 6 inches of black loamy clay soil with 4 more inches of black loamy clay soil. You can have 6 inches of black loamy clay soil with 4 inches of gray loamy clay soil, or 6 inches of black loamy clay soil with 4 inches of white. So the 6 inches has to be black. The next 4 inches, anything chroma 2 or less. All right. Any questions on hydric soils?
Yes. Yeah, we had
Okay.
one. I believe it was on S8, and Josie, you might have to correct me if that was not the case. Or the question is, when you said 10% by volume for the strip matrix, did you mean the volume within that first 6 inches or within the whole cross section?
So within the cross section. And so if you were to cut the soil like this, and so this is a cross-sectional view of the soil, because if you're looking at a soil profile in just on the shovel, it is really hard to estimate 10% if you just draw a line across the soil. So you want to do a cross-sectional view, and I don't know why the pen drew some lines last time, but we'll see what happens. So, you know, if you basically do that, this is roundish, and so we can estimate that each of those quarters is 25%, and then that's 12.5%. And so if we can take all the stripped areas that we observe and they fill more than this one little piece of the pie, then that exceeds the 10% by volume. And so it is on the cross-sectional view. So hopefully that's clear. Any
Oh,
others?
that was very good. Yeah, thank you. No, none, none so far.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and talk about WOTUS now. Actually, no, I'm going to stop. We're going to talk a little bit about core delineation. And I know we've already talked about the hydrologic indicators, and we're not going to get into the weeds as far as the details for vegetative calculations and stuff like that. But the core methodology requires that you meet all three major wetland components. So hydrophytic vegetation, hydric soils, and wetland hydrology. You have to meet all three. In Florida, I feel like it's pretty darn easy to meet hydrophytic vegetation because essentially facultative plants are essentially counted as wetlands. Now, they calculate a little bit differently, but they are counted as a positive for the wetland vegetation. And so it makes it really easy to meet wetland vegetation. In addition to that, slash pine is considered upland for the state, but facultative wet for the core. Gallberry, considered upland for the state, facultative wet for the core. Loblolly pine, upland for the state, facultative for the core. And so there are a handful of species that really are common in Florida and allow us to get to a wetland plant assemblage in the core methodology. And so I find with the core methodology that oftentimes the presence or absence of a hydric soil is the defining characteristic that says, no, this is not wetland, or yes, it is. And any of us that have been out and about in the woods much, or taken ecology classes or vegetative community classes, it's like a pine flatwoods that has a hydric soil stripping at 5 inches versus a pine flatwoods that has stripping at 7 inches, so a non-hydric soil, is pretty much providing the same functions. And so in practice at this point, I generally only flag a single line. Although a federal line could be upslope of my state line, particularly in flatwoods areas. And so I probably shouldn't say this out loud on a recording, but I tend to do my data forms to in areas where there's going to be a clear difference between the upland and wetland. And I mean, that's the reality of it. The goal should be to capture things that are ecologically wetland. And sometimes with methodologies that are codified into law, we put on our blinders and don't step back and see the forest for the trees. And so, I try to keep that in my mind that, we're here to delineate wetlands. We're not here to delineate a hydric soil. And so, you've got a lot more options for hydrologic indicators. It's a lot easier to meet this component than it is in the state methodology. It's a lot easier to meet the vegetative component than in the state methodology. And then, the soils are what the soils are. They're the same for both methods. If anybody does have to do core data forms, a couple of things to keep in mind. Masking, they want that listed in redox feature, even though it's not a redox feature. Strip matrix is always a depletion. And just because there are light areas or dark areas in the soil doesn't mean that they are redox features. And so, I've seen a lot of questions on data forms that are inappropriate questions. Just because there's a light area in the soil doesn't mean that it's a depletion. So, for instance, if you said 0 to 4, so if I were to just write that, you would think, oh, I meet dark surface because 90% of the soil is 3-1. And so how you record this on the state data form versus the federal data form is going to be slightly different. And so I would then come in here and say, okay, 10YR 3-1, and I might say 50% mass sand grains, matrix, texture sandy. And so basically what this saying is 90% of the soil is essentially a 3-1 in color, but it's only 50% masked. And so visually what that means is, 50% of the grains are a 3-1 and 50% of those grains are something else. Either a 4-1 or 5-1 or 6-1. And then we might have 10% 10YR 7/1 pockets or models, whatever you want to call them. And so I always want the total to match 100%. And so then we might have 4 to 6. And I try to keep the descriptions relatively simple, because the more detail you provide, the more questions it can generate. And so if I had I'm going to do two different things here so I don't have to write more lines. So stripping is going to be a depletion within the matrix. And we could, if you had a redox concentration, then you would give it a color, a percentage. It's a concentration. They can be on the pore linings or within the matrix. If I select anything other than matrix here, then I'm going to make a note RCs, or redox concentrations, not on live roots. Or if they are on live roots, I will say RCs on live roots, because then that goes right back to a primary hydrologic indicator of oxidized rhizospheres. And so that's how you should be addressing masking and how you should be addressing stripping and concentrations. Obviously then you'll check your indicators and whether or not an indicator is present. All right. Now I will go ahead and apologize for this part. This is dense. And it's dense reading through the Federal Register or wherever you want to get your updates for WOTUS. And so almost all of this information is pulled verbatim from the proposed updated definition of waters of the United States that was published in the Federal Register in November of last year, which is the most recent Federal Register document for updating waters of the U.S. And also FAQs about WOTUS from the Congressional Research Service in June of last year. And so this document from June of last year does not reflect everything that is within the Federal Register as of November. Now, with all of that said, there is still a good bit of uncertainty regarding WOTUS. And largely that's because in 2023, the Biden administration proposed an updated waters of the U.S., which was immediately challenged. And then the second decision came out and the EPA did a 2023 conforming rule to incorporate the second decision, which then had legal challenges. And those legal challenges have not been decided. They're still in progress. And now the Trump administration has proposed a new updated WOTUS rule, which is undergoing more legal challenges. And so, unfortunately, I cannot give you definitive answers on how the Corps is going to operate. So with all that said, there are about 24 states and territories using the 2023 conforming rule, and about 26 states and territories under the pre-2015 regulations with guidance to conform to the SACIT decision. and Florida is one of the pre-2015 regulation states. However, with the guidance to conform with the Sackett decision, that they seem to be fairly similar, with some differences regarding ditches and with some differences regarding regulatory jurisdiction over lakes and water bodies that were previously regulated under the Commerce Clause. And so in most instances, I think both of these will result in something fairly similar. But again, some slight differences with how ditches are looked at and some slight differences in which systems can actually be regulated. And so one of the most important things for core regulation under the Sackett decision, which has been incorporated into the 2023 conforming rule as well as into the pre-2015 regulations with adjustments per this decision, is adjacent. Previously adjacent was pretty broad. And so these are important components that whenever something says adjacent, you have to think of these two components. First, it has to abut a water of the U.S. or a relatively permanent body of water connected to traditional navigable waters. So basically that means the wetland must be contiguous with a water of the U.S. or tributaries that at least have standing water throughout the wet season, unless we are in a significant drought. The second component is those wetlands must have a continuous surface connection at least during the wet season. And so, they add language about making it difficult to determine where the water ends and the wetland begins, which is weird language. And I don't know if that's like old language that they're bringing in, but, we can all distinguish between a river and a swamp. They're drastically different systems, but those systems would have a swamp would have a continuous surface water connection to that river or to that tributary during the wet season. And so that would be a regulated wetland. And so with the 2015 pre-2015 regulations, which previously included significant nexus, after the Sackett decision, the significant nexus has specifically been stated that does not apply. They guidance to conform with the Sackett decision, specifically the adjacent definition, and defining what a relatively permanent surface connection is. Basically it says they have water almost all the time, blah, blah, blah. But really the limiting component is they must have nearly permanent water during the wet season. And so it wants standing water during the wet season, except during significant droughts. And so it talks about, if you have dual wet seasons, then it should have water during both wet seasons on a very regular basis. If you've got a single wet season, to call it a relatively permanent surface connection, it needs to have standing water during the majority of the wet season on a regular kind of annual basis or during most normal wet seasons. And so, again, I don't expect you to read all of this, but this is waters of the U.S. per the 2023 conforming rule. And I mean, most of this is pretty normal, but the adjacent component and additional waters are the two biggest differences. And so, under the most recent guidance, there's some additional description of tributaries and what constitutes a tributary. And, it goes on to say tributaries are waters of the U.S. if they meet the relatively permanent standard. So they must have standing water contiguous or abutting a traditional navigable water during the wet season to be considered a tributary. Adjacent wetlands, again, have to be adjacent to a traditional navigable water or a tributary that meets those definitions. And those wetlands have to have a continuous surface water connection with tributaries or WOTUS, or tributaries or traditional navigable waters to be regulated. Now, the Corps is not changing their wetland methodology. And so I expect you will end up with the wetland line and then regulated wetlands within that wetland line based on this guidance. One of the big differences between the 2023 conforming rule and the pre-2015 regulatory environment is this additional waters, including intrastate lakes and ponds, streams, or wetlands. And the Commerce Clause was a lot broader in what you could pull into the regulatory scope under additional waters than it is under the 2023 conforming rule or under the revised proposed WOTUS rule that was published in the Federal Register in November of last year. So, since we are using the pre-2015 regulations, the Commerce Clause is still there to regulate other waters. And so, I would expect isolated lakes with public access and public boat ramps are still going to be regulated under that clause. I'm not exactly sure where ditches are going to fall in the pre-2015 regulation, because there seems to still be a little bit of conflicting language. But they're trying to get, at least in what's currently published in the Federal Register, in the November 2025 publishing, they're trying to define how they want to handle ditches a little bit better. I still think there is some conflicting language. And so, this is what was published in November of 2025. It's about 50 pages long of fairly dense and reading with lots of background and history. And so again, almost everything I've pulled out of here came straight out of the Federal Register. All right. So the November proposed rule basically agrees with the Rapanos plurality, or the dominant decision that was made in the Rapanos court decision. And it went on to explain that waters may fairly be read to include only those wetlands that are, as a practical matter, indistinguishable from waters of the United States, such that it is difficult to determine where the water ends and where the wetland begins. Again, this is a legal kind of way to write something that doesn't line up entirely well with ecology unless we look at like the individual definitions of what each of these things are as they're defined in these rules. And so if there is standing water, even if you're in a swamp or forested system during the wet season, that is considered a water, even if it's forested versus a river. And so that's the hard thing to kind of get your head wrapped around. And it goes on to say that occurs when wetlands, so that, this highlighted part, occurs when wetlands have a continuous surface connection to bodies that are waters of the United States in their own right, so that there is no clear demarcation between waters and wetlands. And so they're giving a little bit more explanation below it, saying that, it's difficult to distinguish where the water ends and wetland begins when there is a continuous surface water connection between what we see as the traditional water, a traditional navigable water, or a tributary of those waters. So per the Sackett decision, we're not applying the significant nexus standard. And again, we're going back to the adjacent. So under the Sackett decision, wetlands are not defined as adjacent or jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act solely because they are bordering, contiguous, or neighboring, or separated from other waters of the United States by man-made dikes or barriers, natural river berms, beach dunes, and the like. And so it's saying that those things which have previously been considered adjacent, including shallow groundwater, those are no longer going to be considered adjacent per the Sackett decision and would result in or sever jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. Relatively permanent, again, and I'm mentioning these things kind of loosely as I'm speaking, but there's specific language associated with these terms that is relevant to how we apply the federal methodology. Well, less so how we apply the federal methodology, more so how we determine within what are wetlands, what is federally jurisdictional and what is not. And so relatively permanent means standing or continuously flowing bodies of surface water that are standing or continuously flowing year-round, or at least during the wet season. And so, again, I see the at least during the wet season component as being the limiting factor, because anything that has continuously flowing water year-round is going to be during the wet season. So it's kind of odd to add both. Ephemeral wetlands are those that only have standing water in direct response to precipitation, are not jurisdictional because they are not relatively permanent. And so again, this is the November 2025 proposed rule. I'm not exactly sure, because of all the litigation, how the Corps is going to apply this in relation to the pre-2015 regulations, because they have made multiple adjustments to try to be consistent with the Sackett decision. So tributary is also, important because it has a specific definition as far as what they are considering a tributary. So a tributary does not include a body of water that contributes surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water through a feature, such as a channelized non-jurisdictional surface water feature, so a ditch, subterranean river, culvert, dam, tunnel, or similar artificial feature, or through a debris pile, boulder field, wetland, or similar natural feature, if that feature does not convey relatively permanent flow. And so if a ditch does convey relatively permanent flow, which was previously defined as having water through the majority of a normal wet season, then that ditch could maintain federal jurisdiction into other systems. Features with non-relatively permanent flow, including flow through streams or wetlands, would sever jurisdiction. So if it's a wetland that does not have near, relatively permanent flow all the way to a water of the U.S. or the tributary, that would sever connection. So again, I'm kind of just reiterating these same things because they are the most important components of where the federal jurisdiction under kind of current guidance is severed. Under this proposed approach, only those portions of a wetland with continuous surface hydrology, at least during the wet season, and that are abutting or touching that traditional navigable water or the tributary, would be jurisdictional as adjacent wetlands, no matter the full delineated scope of the wetland. And so if the wetland transitions from having surface water, at least during the wet season, to a seasonally saturated wetland, only that portion that has surface water, at least during the wet season, would be considered to be adjacent under the proposed rule. And so that's vastly different than how adjacent has previously been applied in federal methodology. And so this is probably the most important component for determining what portions of the wetland are federally jurisdictional and which portions of the wetland are not. These are some SNPs directly related to ditches, and there's still a little bit of, I would say, lack of clarity as far as where the ditch severs jurisdiction, whether a ditch that's regularly wet is going to be considered a tributary and allow jurisdiction to extend up that ditch. So basically, to address this confusion, the agencies propose revising the exclusion of certain ditches from the definition of waters of the United States to be simple and clear. And so I would think that if these ditches are excluded from the definition of the waters of the United States, since tributaries are a subset of that they would not be considered tributaries. But like I said, there is still a little bit of conflicting language regarding ditches that have that nearly permanent standing water. So under the proposed rule, and this is the 2025 rule, ditches that are constructed or excavated entirely in dry land are not waters of the United States. End stop. And so, I don't know how that affects ditches that are in uplands and go through multiple wetlands and then uplands and then to a WOTUS. Like, I'm not sure because it does say excavated entirely in dry land. So that would be question number one for me. The agencies also proposed defining the term ditch to mean a constructed or excavated channel used to convey water. The proposed rule excludes ditches that are not part of the naturally occurring tributary system and do not fall under the ordinary meaning of the term waters within the scope of the Clean Water Act. So, we went from something fairly clear to something a little murkier. Under the proposed rule, the agencies limit the exclusion to those non-navigable ditches that are constructed or excavated, again, entirely in dry land. And so this is where, again, it's like, even if those ditches have relatively permanent flow and connect to a jurisdictional water. And so, to me, it seems like there's still some back and forth there as far as where we break or sever that connection and whether or not certain ditches are jurisdictional. So unfortunately, even with the newest guidance, it's still a little bit muddy. And that is kind of the end of the summary of WOTUS. There are probably questions here. But I think, for me, at this point, based on the Sackett decision, ditches still provide a complexity, but if I have a project where I've got a traditional navigable water or tributary, and I've got a swamp that then goes into some type of seepage slope or wet pine flatwoods, I am stopping that federal jurisdiction at the swamp where I have evidence of an ordinary high water line or a lichen line, something telling me that during the wet season, I have standing water across this system. And so that federal jurisdiction limit can be well inside my federal wetland line as well as my state wetland line. And so if there are no proposed impacts to something that is federally jurisdictional per this guidance, I've had many clients choose to withdraw the federal application and just, go down the state permitting path. Obviously, y'all as DOT are in a more complex environment dealing with linear projects and bridges and things like that. Many of your projects are going to touch systems that are clearly within this regulatory framework, but you may have others that are through the middle of the state that have lots of a mosaic of wetlands that are just saturated during the wet season. And per this guidance, there is no reason that you should require a federal permit to work in those wetlands. It repeatedly talks about roadside ditches as being excluded from waters of the U.S. And so, unless you have really wet ditches, y'all will have to make that decision internally. And there is some language in here that talks about, ditches are not canals. And so a canal that is a much larger ditch feature that you can float a boat down, those are still going to be jurisdictional, whereas what we would normally think of ditches where you can't get a boat down them are going to be on the ditch side. And I'm sure there are certain ditches that borderline canals that will, have to get worked out. But I think the majority of things we can differentiate between what's a ditch and what's a canal. It just depends on where the Corps is going to draw that line about, how aggressive are they going to be chasing things up ditches. And we just don't know what the answer is to that at this point. So I'm rambling a little bit at this point. Jonathan, I would say, if anybody has questions, this can be more of a group discussion. I don't know if there are a few folks online that have some opinions on it or experiences that they would like to share that would be useful for the group. But we can go that route. I know that, the Corps would just prefer you to concede that, all the wetlands you're working in are jurisdictional and deal with it that way, because they definitely slow walk AJDs, and those may take well over a year to get an AJD. So if you have projects that are time sensitive, it's rarely easy to get an AJD if you're running on any time frames whatsoever. So I would say we can open up the floor to discussion if there is any.
Sure. Before we get too deep into the discussion of the 2025 rule, we did have a couple questions on that. I wanted to go back to the conforming rule. We had a question on the 2023, that summary page you were showing on the conforming rule. Did that come from their website, or do you have a copy of that? Where did that?
So this came from the. Actually, let me escape out of here, and I'll send this to you. So this came from the Congressional Research Service. So this report is way more readable than the Federal Register, but it hasn't been updated since June of 2025, and the revised WOTUS rule was published in the Federal Register on November 20th of 2025. So it's pretty close in alignment, but there's more information in the Federal Register regarding ditches and tributaries and stuff like that than what is in the congressional report.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and if you could send the link, that'd be helpful.
I will send both those documents, but they actually have a couple of these tables which are pretty nice, clear descriptions. But so tributaries here includes ditches where there's some additional discussion about ditches in the 2025 proposed rule. And so that's where it's like, okay, well, and I know that because of the litigation, it's like some states are using the 2023 conforming rule, some are applying pre-2015 with revisions to conform with SACIT. But now we have the 2025 proposed WOTUS that's going to have some minor effects on both at some point.
Or for the new, for the 2025 rule, there's a lot of discussion on the wet season. Does the Corps have a tool or something that defines what a region's wet season is?
So that is captured in the APT tool, antecedent precipitation tool that can be downloaded from the Corps site. And you can run that tool for your field dates. I mean, obviously you can't run it for dates that you've scheduled a week or so out, but you can run it, a day or two after you've been out in the field, and it will tell you whether or not you're in the wet season or dry season, and whether or not you're considered normal, above normal, or dry. So that is a tool that will help with this. But it does, in a couple places in the 2025 rule, state that it needs to have a continuous surface connection, like for the entirety of the wet season. It doesn't say that exact word, but that's what it's getting at with the language it's using, except during drought period. So if it's a dry wet season, then you wouldn't expect it. But at a normal wet season, it's saying we should have water across this surface almost that entire wet season, which is can really restrict what wetland areas are being regulated by the federal government.
And the last question I had, which goes along to the last page, I believe, of the presentation, was if the connectivity is maintained via culverts, would those connections or adjacent wetlands be considered jurisdictional?
So that I don't have the answer to, which is why there's some contradictory language, because the 2023 conforming rule includes ditches as a tributary, but those ditches would need to have relatively permanent water. So that says that they have to have water standing throughout the wet season. But then the 2025 rule talks about exclusion of certain ditches from the definition of waters of the United States, to be simple and clear. And it says that ditches excavated entirely in dry land are not waters of the U.S. But it goes on to talk about let's see, down here, under the proposed rule, the agencies limit the exclusion to those non-navigable ditches that are constructed or excavated entirely in dry land, even if those ditches have relatively permanent flow and connect to a jurisdictional water. So if it's saying these are not waters of the U.S., then how can something be adjacent? Because they have to be adjacent to a water of the U.S. or tributary thereof. And tributaries with that relatively permanent water are considered waters of the U.S. They're just a subset of it. So I would think that if the ditch is not a water of the U.S., then any wetlands adjacent to it, those wetlands are not adjacent to a water of the U.S. But you look at the summary here, and this is the 2023 conforming rule, and it specifically has ditches in here. So unfortunately, I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I think it's easy. If it's a ditch that does not have normal standing water, then it's not a water of the U.S. That severs federal jurisdiction, and any wetlands upslope no longer have federal jurisdiction unless there are other connections. The difficulty gets, a lot of ditches more so in South Florida, regularly have water in them. And they regularly connect out to waters of the U.S. But, shoot. So under the proposed rule, the agencies limit the exclusion to those non-navigable ditches that are constructed or entirely excavated entirely in dry land, even if those ditches have relatively permanent flow. And so, I mean, I would think that, if there was a ditch through a wetland, it's still regulated. once that ditch is excavated in uplands, I would think that's where, and it's a non-navigable ditch, I would think that's where jurisdiction is severed. Now, again, if there are folks on here that have had different experiences with the Corps, if they've tried to get some AJDs, I'm sure the whole group would benefit from that. Just reading the proposed rule and the 2023 conforming rule and the pre-25 regulations. Under the proposed, I think ditches are being looked at differently than they are under 2023 conforming or pre-2015. Or at least they're proposed to be looked at differently. And, if any of y'all have tried to get clear guidance out of the Corps, that's not a very easy thing to do in the best of times, much less when there are all these different versions of WOTUS being applied in different regions of the country.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, yeah, you said it right there. There's a lot of different interpretations flying around right now.
There are.
But that's it for the questions that we have so far.
Okay, so that's all the presentation material I have prepared for this part of the class. For those of you that are newer, I think there might be some consultants to DOT on the line as well. Through my company, we do offer delineation classes and hydric soil classes. We've offered classes to individual companies if they have 8 to a dozen staff, but particularly for those newer folks coming out, this was probably a lot of material. Extract out of it what you can, and then seek out some other help or coursework or guidance from peers as you can. Let's see, can I get rid of this? There we go. So the field portion of the class is going to be on May 28th, and we're going to be southwest of Orlando at the Tibbet Butler Nature Preserve. We've got that all squared away with Orange County and the park manager there. There's a big parking facility. There are bathrooms on site. There's a nice pavilion that we can have lunch on site if you bring your own lunch. We've got some fun communities to look at. We've got some seepage areas. We've got some really borderline flatwoods areas that we'll have some good discussion in. And then, depending on timing and how long we take to get through things, we could come down to the lake and look at how you would apply a surface water delineation as well. And whether or not that would result in a higher wetland boundary than where we have wetlands. So I think, Jonathan, I think you kind of coordinated a hotel nearby for the folks attending the field class.
Yes, yeah, and I do, just real quick, I'll make clear, this part that Travis is talking about right now, the attendees for that have already been decided. It's going to be a small group of DOT staff who will be going to this. But yeah, we have there is a group of hotels that were there near off of I-4 somewhere.
Okay,
not terribly far away, yeah.
All right, and before that, I'm sure you'll send out an email to the dozen or so DOT folks that are going to attend the field training, a start time and things like that.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I'm game to start whenever. So obviously we'll keep an eye on weather as we approach that week, and start a little bit earlier if we need to, if weather's going to look rough.
Definitely.
All right. Thank y'all. And, hopefully this has been useful, maybe triggered a few memories about delineation. And it's like, oh yeah, I need to remember that.